With all the fear, misunderstanding, and tension during this coronavirus outbreak, sometimes it's important to look back and remember, we've done this before. Stick around as Big Easy Life discusses New Orleans history with outbreaks. As I sit here in my lab, working on a vaccine for the latest outbreak, I realize a few things. First, I hope Heisenberg doesn't come back before I'm done with his lab. And second, most locals obviously haven't been around long enough to remember, but New Orleans is no stranger to plague, pestilence, and outbreak. This picture here at the New Orleans Pharmacy Museum, taken just this week, shows they remember their past, even if most of us don't. The globes you see filled with the colored water represent the different illnesses currently being treated. And it was a bad day for all of us to see all the globes the same color. It meant one thing: a plague. Now, the good news is things have changed. All the precautions that are being put in effect are about preventing that spread, stopping this beastie before it takes hold. In the past, we were not so fortunate. So when we talk about outbreaks in New Orleans, it's kind of like talking about hurricanes. You know how it works if you're a local. If I say I lost my house during the hurricane, capital H, with no precursor, it means big K. That's a Katrina comment right off the bat. Everything else would get a separate tag. For the Crescent City Contagion Club, this distinction goes to one thing, and that's yellow fever. Known as the Saffron Scourge, Yellow Jack, the Stranger's Fever, Bronze John on his saffron steed. Yeah, I didn't make that up. That's actually what they called it. Or just the Yellow Death. History paints tableaus of deeply haunted lives during a span of years almost 100 long. It wasn't until the turn of the 20th century that serious concerted efforts were put into trying to rid us of this virus. Between 1796 and 1905, 67 yellow fever outbreaks transpired in New Orleans. During that time frame, roughly 50,000 people died. During the worst year, the dead were stacked on top of each other in the ever-expanding cemeteries. The mortuary chapel was built during these time frames simply to handle yellow fever victims and the overflow because they didn't want to move the bodies through the center of the city. The scourge wasn't, however, lethal to everyone. In the early days of yellow fever, especially native Louisianians were less likely to die, as were slaves and free people of color, earning it the nickname the stranger's disease. It's unknown why this occurred, but I'd like to hope it was a gift to all of us who were living here for having to put up with a lifetime of airplane-sized mosquitoes. Now, physicians treated the fever with bloodletting, leeches, purging, and mercury consumption. Boy, that's an excellent idea. The patient has no more fever when they take enough mercury. When the epidemics grew in severity as the century wore on, officials would burn tar at night in an attempt to purify that air. They called it a miasma. Once in 1853, cannons were shot and thought that the city would be rid of this foul odor by the smoke from the cannons. I hear people today asking why certain groups have the right to dictate whether businesses and groups can congregate and open with COVID-19 in our midst. The answer is, we insisted that someone be in charge. And when I say we as Louisianans and long-term residents. In response to the 1817 death toll of 800 in New Orleans, the state legislature passed an act allowing for the creation of a board of health in New Orleans. But when this minimally funded board quarantine measures went unheeded by the local populace and subsequently failed to stop the disease, the legislature in 1819 rescinded the act. It wasn't until 1834 when a group of New Orleans doctors interested in researching the disease founded the Medical College of Louisiana, which turned later to become Tulane University. Now, the doctors were mostly on their own until 1855, when the Louisiana Board of Health became a permanent part of our Louisiana government. The commercial interests in Louisiana at the same time were decimated during the yellow fever summers, when thousands of people fled town, so there was no one there to buy their wares. So during future outbreaks, they weren't keen on education of people in fear of driving those customers away. They attempted to convince officials and newspapers not to release news of the scourge to the public. This might have something to do with how the press handled or didn't handle news of these epidemics. Many news outlets reasoned that extensive coverage would create public hysteria. Nearly all publications citywide avoided printing related news or death tolls. I hope you can see the reverse correlation to our current situation and why early understanding of the virus and tough safety rules can save lives, and in the long run, hopefully save businesses. It's tough to lose money from being controlled and shut down. It's even worse when you start losing all your employees to illness and death. Now, I've had many varied careers. One is that of being a paramedic. For 3 decades now, I've worked in and around the city of New Orleans. I don't want to see another 1853 outbreak. Oh, you don't know the 1853 outbreak? All right, let me fill you in. That would be the year where in New Orleans, the recorded death toll was 7,849 men, women, and children from yellow fever. The decade total was almost 18,000. I know modern medicine and understanding of health has made something like this unlikely, but any number is too high if we can prevent it by taking simple precautions. Well, my latest experiment is nearly complete in the back, so I'll leave you with some information on the last known yellow fever outbreak in America. This last epidemic occurred in Louisiana in 1905. In 1905, the epidemic showed how effective an all-out campaign of information, organization, and action can be when citizens, elected officials, and medical experts combine to fight a disease. Oh, these aren't my words. This was the thoughts of Roosevelt in his New Orleans speech. He called their response nothing less than unprecedented and heroic, saying they took hold of it after it had started, and when it had got well underway, they controlled and conquered it. That seems like a resounding way to handle things. So, in conclusion, yes, it sucks to be in a city under siege. I feel for those that are out of work due to this. One of my other jobs is as a tour guide in the city. That means no work for me under that front. So I get it. PM me, drop me a line. If you need help, if you need a meal, if you need me to hook you up with somebody that I may know to keep things rolling during these tough times, I'll see what I can do. We know it sucks, but the other option is just not worth considering. We're resilient people. We'll look back on this as we do all the hardships that have befallen us over the years, and we'll laugh. The sheer lunacy of this all. But you want to know the best thing about all this? We'll be there to laugh.